Welcome, everyone, to an evening at the Quill and Tankard with the hosts of Maester Monthly, your favorite pseudo-monthly podcast hosted by the moderators of the Song of Ice and Fire subreddit. When we do these special Quill and Tankards, it's always for a special occasion, and today is a very special occasion. Can someone tell me why today is such a special occasion?
It's Fat Walda's birthday.
Right.
It is Fat Walda's birthday.
That's right, it is. I am one of your hosts, Michael, also known as Bookshelfstud.
And I'm another one of your hosts, Eliana, also known as Glass Table Girl.
And I'm another one of your hosts, Nat, also known as JoeMagician.
I'm Aaron.
Aaron.
And we also have friend of the show, Jeff/BryndenBFish.
I'm not your friend, bro. But no,
That's right, your family, Jeff.
I'm not my real family. Not my real brother. But no, hi guys. Jeff, BryndenBFish here. Happy to be here to talk about Fat Walda's birthday for this 45-minute podcast. Can't wait to get deep into Fat Walda's personal history and see what interpretations and analysis we can do about everything Fat Walda. So looking forward to it for a long time now. And yeah, I'm just happy to be here.
Long time, first time. Yeah, right.
He's real excited for us to dox her.
That's true. Yeah, the day has come. What should be obvious from all of the context clues that you got by clicking on this video, we are going to be talking about the recently announced Game of Thrones prequel spin-off pilot episode, which has been ordered by HBO. Just a little bit of background. The very little we know about it is that it will take place thousands of years before the events of Game of Thrones and chronicle the world's descent from the golden age of heroes into its darkest hour. And only one thing is for sure, says the publicity text, from the horrifying secrets of Westeros' history to the true origin of the White Walkers, the mysteries of the East, the Starks of legend, it's not the story we think we know. Dun,
Yeah.
dun,
my
dun.
God.
It's a good pitch letter.
It is, yeah. So yeah, the spin-off has been announced.
Well, the pilot. This is one pilot.
The pilot has been ordered for one of the spin-offs.
Yes.
Yeah, it's exciting, I guess. I mean, it's for me, I don't know how you guys feel. It was unexpected. My take was that we were going to get something more Targaryen history oriented for the spin-off show. That was going to be brought to pilot first. And it's also interesting too that the person who was selected was Jane Goldman, who is a terrific writer who wrote things like the X-Men prequels, Kick-Ass, and a few other things that are escaping my head right now. Kingsman, there you go. She wrote Kingsman.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because I, as much as I am excited about what she's going to be bringing to the fore, I figured it would probably be someone like Brian Cogman and George's Vehicle that would come forward because, these guys have an established history with HBO and with Game of Thrones, and Cogman is the keeper of the lore, so to speak, on the show, and of course George R. R. Martin is the creator of A Song of Ice and Fire. So you figure that was the show that was going to be brought. I know, right? Crazy as it sounds, and we're probably revealing some brand new information to y'all. Crazy as it sounds, though, I figured they would be the folks to be picked up, but kind of a little bit of surprise and a little bit of an interesting take too on what they're going to be depicting, the history of the White Walkers and the Age of Heroes. Not something I expected. Did you guys expect it?
Well,
Yeah.
Somebody expected it. Who was that? Who expected it, you guys?
I don't know. Who was that?
can I get a Joe?
I think
Can
that
I
was
get
Joe.
a magician?
JoeMagician.
from a Weirwood.
In the house.
In our spin-off episode, this was my pitch because I rule. And this is basically about me. Like, this isn't really about Game of Thrones or Jane Goldman or anything. This is about how right I am.
That's
in this
why
moment.
you were excited for this.
That's why I was excited.
Oh.
That's why I dragged you all here at 10 o'clock at night to do this.
Yeah.
Just to live it up.
That's right.
To go back to the reasons I thought this was a good pitch to begin with was that with a lot of the other history and lore, there's not a lot of places for a new writer to take the story because a lot of it's very detailed. It's the Targaryen history, Dance of the Dragons, Robert's Rebellion. Whereas if you go to an origin story, which Jane Goldman, this is basically what she writes. All these stories that you mentioned, Jeff, are all origin stories for something bigger and a lot of world building in them. this is basically a blank slate. The world of Ice and Fire itself has a lot of fake, really fake history in it. They're told as myths. They're specifically said to be unreliable. So she and George can take this anywhere they want. They can make up almost any plot, and it will work because it doesn't have to be accurate to any book text that already exists. So
well, here's a question I have. Do you think, is this going to spoil some of the endgame stuff from A Song of Ice and Fire? If we find out what the origin of the White Walkers, seemingly from season 4 or 5 of the show, is it 6? I can't remember. Where it's revealed that the White Walkers were created by the Children of the Forest. If they go back and they retcon it and be like, oh, actually it was not this way, it was done something else, would that spoil something that's going to be important for the end game of A Song of Ice and Fire, the book series? Or is that a moot point at this stage in our wait for the next 2 books from A Song of Ice and Fire?
Based on this pitch, that sounds like that's going to be the finale of whatever this prequel is. Because they say they specifically said they're going to start in the Age of Heroes and then watch as the world falls into darkness. So the creation of the others and the start of the Long Night will probably be like the last season. I guess it will kind of ruin it in a way. But yes, we have seen that scene, and presumably at the end of Game of Thrones season 8, we're going to see a wrap up of where that ends. But how you get Todrick Stark.
Todrick, yeah.
Todrick. How you get to Todrick tied up to a stone in Children of the Forest, stabbing him with obsidian in the heart? There's a lot of ways you could take that.
Well,
yeah.
I did want to in the timeline that we have for the ancient history, and obviously it's all the monks of Westeros are the ones who wrote it and all that. So the conceit is that it's unreliable, but the idea is that the Age of Hero, the Long Night, the Long Night, including the Battle for the Dawn and Azor Ahai and all that, happens during the Age of Heroes, but it's not the end of it. The end of it is the Andal invasion. That's when the Age of Heroes comes to an end. And the Age of Heroes begins with the signing of the Pact on the Isle of Faces and ending the war between the First Men and the Children of the Forest. So it's definitely... there's room for the Long Night to happen and the story to maybe pick up during that or with the start of the Long Night or something, and it to still explore sort of the end of the Age of Heroes. Yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to throw that out there in terms of world buildy kind of stuff.
I mean, that's a good point.
So do you think it's going to be something kind of anthology based as opposed to we're following around Bran, Arya, Sansa, Tyrion, Jon Snow, Daenerys for 8 seasons? Is it going to be season 1, the story of Lan the Clever, season 2, the story of Brandon the Builder, season 3, the Long Night, season 4, the Andal Invasion, season 5, the Pact, or something like that? Or do you think it's going to be more, we're following the same sort of trajectory that we saw in Game of Thrones?
So you basically just pitched True Detective.
Ooh.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, right.
in Westeros.
Yes.
It's a good idea.
Mean, and that would probably be maybe easier for them logistically if they're not having to keep the same high-paid main cast, for X number of seasons, but instead can say, all right, let's do, 6 episodes on this cool little sub-story.
It's true. They're also widening the scope so much. We heard in this, they're going to Ashai. We're going to be seeing most of Essos, probably be seeing Westeros, be seeing probably the Great Empire of the Dawn. They already struggled with kind of maintaining 2 plot lines going on simultaneously across continents. I don't know if they're going to be able to pull that off in a way that they feel connected at all.
I kind of just feel like that's a sales pitch. A lot of what they put in the tagline, besides the time frame that it was going to be in the Age of Heroes, it's the story that you don't think that you know or whatever. That sounds like a kind of like a traditional tagline of any adaptation.
Yeah.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
And we did get kind of burned by that recently when it was, we thought that the Fire and Blood Volume 1 would reveal the origin of Dany's dragon eggs. George came back and was like, actually, guys, it's not. That's just press. So It's possible that it could just be the hype machine working its way into motion and not having any ramifications for what we actually see on screen.
Also, the same thing happened with Game of Thrones. It's the story that you think that you know, but then
Right.
turns out it's not.
Totally. I mean, that's basically how they got season 1, right? Was like, oh, you think Ned Stark's the main character, but he's really not.
Oh, I meant season 500s, but you.
Oh.
your thing
I figured that's where she was going with that.
Oh, yours is funnier though.
Mine is saltier.
Pretty
But it's also
salty.
like
I'll share that salt.
if I remember correctly, the tagline for like A Dance with Dragons, like years before it actually came into publication, was something about the characters will journey to the house to House Dane, and the Danes are going to have a role there. They're all going to have a conflagration at Starfall, and that didn't really come into effect in A Feast for Crows or A Dance with Dragons. So if your folks are reading this tagline and some of the hype stuff, take it with a grain of salt, because we don't know precisely how much of it is going to be encapsulated in the show, or what they're even going to do with it. Part of my question is related to this idea of whether it's going to be an anthology show or whether it's going to be something more traditional as we saw in Game of Thrones. And I think it's an open question until it's not an open question, right? I mean, we just don't know enough information right now. But there is something interesting I wanted to bring up about this, and that I know that there was a number of people who were disappointed that there's, for whatever reason, that you're not going to have a Targaryen show pop up.
For some
why?
What does this mean for Fire
More
and
Targaryen
Blood?
history?
I think a lot of us were thinking that Fire and Blood was being published because it was going to overlap with some of the story of the spin-off. But now it seems like...
Well, to be fair, it could be that Fire and Blood was originally intended for that, but when they hadn't made the final selection for the show, they were going to bring to pilot. But it can still have that impact too, because George said something back in 2017 where he says, quote, "You should not expect to see all 5 shows, at least not immediately, much as I might love the idea. HBO is not about to become the Game of Thrones network, but we could possibly see 2 or even 3 make it to the pilot stage, with one series emerging on air in 2019 or 2020, and the others maybe later, if they come out as well as we all hope." And then he goes on to say, "Then again, maybe I should not speculate. You folks get way too excited. Truth is, no one knows."
Us? What?
So you could, Fire and Blood Volume 1 coming out might be related to the shows that were attempting to reach pilot stage even back in 2017. And we could see this show pop up in 2019 or 2020, and then have Aegon's Conquest, The Dance of the Dragons, The 10,000 Ships, the Young Tywin series that our co-moderator Hamfast42 really wants to see come on air. These things could go. No, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the Sea Snake, pitched by another moderator.
Song of the Sea Snake: The Adventures of Corlys
Velaryon. Yeah, that'd be cool. I'd be down for that, and I think that's probably. I think to answer Aaron's question, it's probable that there was a little bit of that in mind. I also think too that Fire and Blood Volume 1 was coming out because George is like, I'm not going to get the Windsor Winter out before season 8, and we need to have something for book readers before the final season of the show airs. And
I will also add to this mix that Amazon, obviously recently the Aragorn information kind of leaked that Amazon's going to be doing an Aragorn prequel-ish kind of thing. And they are also, I believe they have a Conan the Barbarian show in the works as well.
Really?
I don't know how far along that is, but that's sort of been floating around for a while. I think Adam Whitehead has a great list out there of like currently in development sci-fi fantasy projects. So because what struck me about this premise is that it's way more high fantasy than Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is basically like, it opens as basically like Richard III, it opens as like a Shakespeare play.
Yeah.
Where it's very much realist, and then you slowly add in the fantasy. But this is basically like the horrifying secrets of Westeros history, the true origin of the White Walkers, like all this very high fantasy stuff right off the bat. So do you think they're trying to go head to head with like high fantasy Amazon shows with this?
If they're going to, I think the ready-made character for that is you just start off with Bran the Builder, and you just warp forward throughout his life as he gets older. Like you start off with him just like maybe like in some village in the north or somewhere, and you just follow him as he explores all these places to parallel the Aragorn story. Because I mean, they call him out in this press release and Land the Clever, so you got to figure those are two characters they're going to hit in a big way.
Well, to clarify, they call James Hibbard calls them out in his article, but not the press release doesn't call them out. Some of the like in the article, Hibbard writes some of the major names which could be characters in the new show include Bran the Builder and Land the Clever. So like I just want to make sure we're differentiating between what James Hibbard wrote on Entertainment Weekly and what they're putting out in their publicity materials. Because I've always been of the opinion, personally, that Bran the Builder is not one person, that he's the agglomeration of a bunch of different brands. So I'm kind of that's what has me kind of interested here. Is like I was assuming that a lot of these figures were, you know, the confluence of a bunch of different kings or historical figures or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
So are we going to find out that there was a real Bran the Builder, or are we going to find out that it was like 15 different brands, all of whom had different construction projects they worked on?
Or it'd be one Bran, you just do a series of like 5 and 10 year gaps. And you just get different actors doing it that way.
Like The Crown style, maybe.
You just keep moving throughout the storyline forward, and that's how you maybe could bridge the Age of Heroes and the Long Night in a way that doesn't feel ridiculous. In the way that Game of Thrones takes place over like 2 or 3 years or something like that. You could just make this decades if you wanted to, and just keep changing the actor in between seasons.
I guess one of my, I want to say, hesitations is that, you know, like as we were talking about, it's not the story you think you know or whatever. Part of what I loved about the histories of the Age of Heroes was that ambiguity, and I kind of don't want to find out if Bran the Builder was several brands or if he was just a single brand. That's like, I like that mystery and murkiness of not knowing. But also to go back to what we were talking about earlier about the anthology idea, I was wondering, like, I was throwing around ideas on Twitter, and one of them was like, oh, they could be different vignettes or something kind of like Black Mirror. Or Maester Mary on Twitter, the Maester in White Harbor, said, I love the idea of a story within a story, and having a green seer / child of the forest telling fables / horror stories / passing on knowledge at the end of the long night. You could work in both timelines, perhaps, given that the end is maybe a given, as one way to deliver sort of that anthology idea.
That's a good idea.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, and that does raise a good question of like, are they gonna have a framing device for the series, like a Children of the Forest tying it all together, or you know, and one of the many old Nans through the years.
I was about to say, what if it's old Nan's stories? What if we just hear her telling this to one of the other Starks, like not Bran himself, but like maybe like Rickard. She's telling Rickard Stark all these stories or something like that.
Little Ned.
I would love
or Little
that.
Ned.
That would be pretty cute. And I mean, I wouldn't put it past them, I guess.
They may not want to stretch the timeline this much, but I would bet 5 gold shadow parrots that they would begin the pilot with a focus on a young slave girl named Melanie.
Interesting.
Several thousand years in the past, because the show hasn't done anything with that. They just had that scene
She was
that
very
showed
old.
that Melisandre was really old, and nothing else was done with it. So maybe that's just D&D not knowing like how to write a narrative, or
or it's the long con.
yeah, maybe it's like a setup. I don't know.
Yeah, but
Isn't it cool? She's so old. Well, that's all we got.
That would be. I mean, that would be a huge retcon if it turned out she was there at the same time as like the first Azor Ahai.
And then she forgot or something. Just like over 10,000 years, forgot
like,
everything that happened to her.
Became, you know, like she spent the rest of her thousands of years of life searching for the next Azor Ahai, and has been like.
Oops.
What if it's
like
a comedy?
in the Matrix.
Anthology? What if it's a comedy anthology about her constantly misidentifying people as Azor Ahai? Like she shows up at like some random old dude's house. She's like, aha, yes, you were born of salt and smoke, right?
No,
Maybe she was the first Azor Ahai.
I'm pretty sure this is just, again, the storyline to the Matrix, where they keep trying to find the one.
You're right.
Oh yeah. Do we get
Yep.
the scene with the architect? I want to see the architect again.
The architect is a giant turtle.
Nailed it.
Sitting in a
The
green-
old man in the river.
Old man in the river.
Yes. That's it.
Although honestly, I would
Yeah.
like to see a story about the Roinar. That would be pretty cool.
Yeah, 10,000 ships seems
It's what
like
we
very
deserve.
fertile ground. Yeah.
Yeah.
I do think that we will eventually see like a Dance of the Dragon show, since that seems to be George's most complete material in terms of what he has in the history books. It also seems to have a bit of a narrative behind it as well. Whereas this show, there's a number of stories in the world of Ice and Fire about, and legends and myths about the founding of the world and about the Long Night and about the Age of Heroes, but nothing is at all set in foundation in stone. Whereas the Dance of the Dragons is very much like this happened and this happened and this happened and this person was allied with this person and you had this faction fighting against this faction and so on. So I think that's that's likely to come at some point down the road.
I wonder if this choice is a reaction to two things. One, book fan reaction as the Game of Thrones has gone on, as Eliana alluded to, that people are upset how far it's diverged. Well, if you have nothing to compare it to, then it's hard to complain about it, I guess, in that way. And the second thing is that Fire and Blood and the Book of Swords got kind of very lackluster reactions. So maybe HBO got scared off by that and went for like the real crazy one that will compete with Aragorn.
Well, there's another option too. The third option, and I think this one is actually close to the truth, is that the show is different enough from the storyline, but it has the same sort of ethos behind it as well, that or not ethos, but rather a same sort of narrative current flowing through it, that it's easy to transition, but at the same time, it's not as similar to, it's not the story of Ned Stark done all over again. It's not the story of betrayals, families, dragons, tits and dragons, and all that type of stuff. It's a little bit different and a bit of a different focus than what we'll see in what we have seen the past 7-8 years now, I guess, now for Game of Thrones.
Instead of dragons, it's a focus on squishers.
Squisher.
Yes. Go full deep ones. The
Wow.
Cthulhu shows up.
I thought the squishers were the tits.
Oh,
Wow.
hot take.
What kind of
Deep.
What kind of tits do you know with tentacles, Aaron?
Well,
What
Never
kind
mind.
of tits do you not know?
Never seen tentacles on them.
To go back to
You're
Jeff's
doing
first
it wrong.
question
You need to Google
About-
more.
about like, did you expect that it would be Jane Goldman? One of the more interesting things I think looking at this is how D&D were chosen to do the Game of Thrones original TV series, which is back in like 2006-7. They
Yep.
pitched it to George. This was an entirely different universe for the comic and fantasy genre and TV film. Like you had like the Batman movies that would pop up every 4 years or so, or you'd have the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, or like the couple X-Men movies. But besides that, there weren't superhero movies at this time. Iron Man didn't come out until what, like 2008
2007.
or so. So
2008.
like at this time, you would never expect somebody who is a big comic book fan, comic book writer to gain like a showrunner creator position on such a major series. And I think it's an interesting reflection on that she's going to be doing these reigns now, whereas before that wasn't really possible. And to some degree, she's more writ of the same cloth as George is, and that she's done a lot of comic book films and has a big interest in that genre, whereas D&D were like not really. I mean, they did some stuff store with like Troy, but
Yeah, they did try.
Great movie.
I agree. I mean, if you look at Kingsman, X-Men First Class, Kick-Ass, these are mostly action comic movies, which makes you wonder about what kind of story got pitched to HBO. Like what kind of action, what kind of pacing to the show? Are we gonna do away entirely with people talking in throne rooms? Is it just gonna be like one person running around kicking ass all the time?
I had to go back and reread my post that I made in like May of last year because I had forgotten all about it. But I basically said, because I like tried to figure out what all the writers were working on. I said that Jane would be doing like the magical version of the story, the one that would be more intertwined with doing like Harry Potter meets Game of Thrones a bit more, where people have somewhat superpowers added into it, which might be a direction for Game of Thrones to take, to add more of the supernatural in, which also makes me think to like maybe she might, and this is also a reflection maybe on the books and TV in general, because I wonder where the show is going to go to build itself off as a prequel on the existing structure of Game of Thrones, because like every narrative has to continue on that variation. And so one thing to go off of with that is to maybe Jane may tap into some dropped narratives from the original Game of Thrones books. We may get the story of Quentin popping in some way into this version. Or get
Victorian.
you could see
Victorian,
Victorian pop up. You could see Ariane. Jane Goldman would be probably the best writer you could find to actually write Ariane, and could probably even do it better than George could.
Well,
I mean, would she focus as much on the responsiveness and all that? I mean, that's
exactly. That's
might.
really important.
yeah. It does seem, like she does seem very well suited to this sort of like heightened actiony. I mean, saying comic booky is redundant, but comic booky kind of characters. She is currently also working on writing a Fables movie. The Fables comics.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Really?
Yeah, she's also working on the screenplay for Disney's live-action The Little Mermaid.
Perfect.
The
Squishers. We're there.
Wait,
gonna
Disney's
get-
what? Sorry, my internet cut out.
The
The Little Mermaid.
Oh,
Yeah. I don't know if that's actually like in progress or not, but that's what's like one of her latest projects listed.
she's got a lot going on.
Yeah,
That's
but she
something
does.
on
Good for her. Go get it, girl.
She also, by the way, co-wrote Stardust, which is one of my favorites.
Yeah.
So
It's very high fantasy, isn't
Which
it?
is yes,
Oh.
Stardust, and it's an adaptation of a. Is that the one that's an adaptation of a Neil
Gaiman.
Gaiman book?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, basically her whole career is like adapting sort of high fantasy or like high, supery magic kind of things into, at the very least, not bad movies, if not really good movies.
And I think a strength that she has is I haven't read Stardust, but my understanding is that it has quite a different ending. And I did read Kick-Ass. I haven't kept up with the rest of the series, but it definitely diverged from the comic. In some ways it had a different like message and theme, but while it was a different story in many ways, it still was a good standalone product, if that makes sense. So I guess that makes sense for her then to do this Age of Heroes.
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
Like I said, I'm just still surprised that they went in a high fantasy direction.
Who isn't surprised?
Yeah.
I mean, I love
wrong,
high
guys.
fantasy stuff, but I really thought they would have leaned more heavily into the
Realism.
Sopranos in Middle Earth kind of thing,
Yeah.
to shy away from Amazon's more high fantasy stuff that they're doing.
I think it shows a paradigm shift in the culture, though, more than anything else, right? That's something
Yeah.
Aaron was alluding to, is that this show that is being pitched to HBO would not have been made in 2011.
Totally.
They pitched Game of Thrones as The Sopranos meet Middle Earth, so you had two existing franchises and two existing properties that were popular and had achieved a significant cultural zeitgeist in the early to mid 2000s, and being able to translate that leads to a interesting fantasy concept. But now that we're beyond that, we can have the Aragorn show and have the Game of Thrones origin story of all of A Song of Ice and Fire. And I think that's an interesting way that our culture is kind of moving past moving to the point where it's cool, to head into these high fantasy concepts. We have stuff not just in The Song of Ice and Fire world, but you have The Name of the Wind that's being adapted into a movie or shows, or I think both. So we're getting to the point now where fantasy and science fiction are a part of the cultural mainstream. They're not on the fringes anymore. And I think that's a good thing ultimately for the direction of our fiction consumption going forward.
That's true. That also happened in Star Wars, where they've really amped up what the Force can do in their characters, particularly in The Last Jedi. What Luke did with the astral projection and Leia flying through space, and like the Force battle between Kylo and Rey. That's a significant jump forwards from what the other movies were able to do with the Force. So that could, like you're saying, that could be just sort of an indicator of what audiences are willing to go for with this kind of thing.
Well, actually, it's not that big of a jump forward if you read the EU stuff from
jump
back
forward
in,
based on what was on the screen.
if you played Knights of the Old Republic 2. I mean, it is. How do you think this was pitched then? Because maybe they pitched it as Game of Thrones meets the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Probably.
Game of Thrones meets X-Men.
Meets X-Men Origins. I mean, she wrote it.
Yeah, right. She wrote First Class and Future Past.
If you're looking for somebody to do a movie like that about about superheroes and Game of Thrones, Jane Goldman is the writer that you want.
Yeah.
Like, she wrote the two best back-to-back superhero movies. I don't think there's ever been two back-to-back that are as good as those two.
First Class and Future Past.
Yeah.
You thought Future Past was good?
Ooh. Wow.
90% of viewers did, according to Rotten Tomatoes. But I actually haven't seen Future Past, so I'm not gonna.
I've only seen the clips of Quicksilver.
Oh, how they redid the same scene from the first movie.
It was really good.
Both times.
Both times, it was great. I enjoyed it on YouTube.
Yeah, I did.
But what were you saying, Leon? You were about to say something, and I just.
I was gonna say two things that were mildly unimportant, but I'm gonna say them anyway now that I have the floor.
Go for it.
Which is that if it were pitched as like Game of Thrones meets Marvel, I mean, it is called the Age of Heroes after all, and Age of Superheroes. Second thing is also incredibly mildly unimportant, but what if the Age of Heroes spin-off is in fact the Aragorn prequel, and they are one and the same?
There is quite a lot of
the story
Lord of the Rings, Song, Ice, and Fire crossover. Yes, I'm in. Get me and Pat Spanagle on the writing team. We're in.
Are you saying this is actually like the team up of the century?
Yes.
Yeah.
A more ambitious crossover than
Infinity War.
Infinity War.
I mean, the superheroes sounds like a really bad mobile game download.
Oh my god, it does. Yeah. Yeah, Age of the Superheroes definitely gives your
I'm gonna look this
phone
up.
a virus.
This is a thing. Hang on, Game of Superheroes.
They're probably gonna call it something different. I can't imagine they're just gonna call it the Age of Heroes.
On on our earlier Maester Monthly, we pitched it as Game of Thrones Origins.
Yeah,
that's what Sam called it.
I wonder if they're gonna stick with Game of Thrones as the brand. Like,
oh yeah, definitely.
I mean, obviously they will say like Game of Thrones prequel or whatever, but if it'll be if they'll do Game of Thrones Origins, or if it'll be like I don't know,
Fear the Walking Dead versus The Walking Dead, that kind of thing.
Yeah, first Game of Thrones.
It's a big enough franchise that they don't have to. Like, the Fantastic Beasts franchise isn't using the term Harry Potter in it, but everyone knows it's the Harry Potter story.
That's true. That they can. Well, that's what I'm wondering, if they're going to go with like the War of Ice and Fire, or so, like go with some sort of related franchisee name, but not necessarily Game of Thrones.
But if they're changing the aesthetic so much, I mean, would you really want to move away from the name? Like what Aaron is talking about. If it really is a different style of show, like Fantastic Beasts and Harry Potter are still visually and like stylistically in the same universe. Like if they go a real different way, you may not want to lose them in.
In my opinion, they should, just because like I loved The Legend of Korra from the Avatar series, but they eventually got to a point where they realized, hey, we have to like really break from the first series because it's holding us back, because people keep comparing us to the first series and to the characters there, and they're like, oh, this isn't Aang. And I think that that's something they're going to have to wrestle with in creating this Age of Heroes spin-off.
I think that's a really good point. Actually, didn't Legend of Korra do like the Age of Heroes version of Avatar?
For like an episode, which was amazing. It was the best
Avatar
episode
1?
of that season.
Yeah,
The best 2 episodes of that season.
they did
That
this.
season was the weakest season, but season 3 is a perfect season. Just saying. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, like, do you think it's possible for them to do a Game of Thrones with sort of heightened superhero-y main characters and still have it keep that for lack of a better word, gritty Game of Thrones feel?
But do you want it to have the same feel? I mean, that's the question that you're going to have.
Sure, yeah.
You want it to have just be Game of Thrones yet again, and I get that.
That's the title.
Game of Thrones again.
Yet again.
But do you want it to just be like a rehash of things that you're familiar with, or are you supposed to take the existing intellectual property and make it something new and better, expand it a bit, give it a different feel? I was not, as you guys might know, I was not the biggest fan of Rogue One, the Star Wars story, the first one that came out, but I did get a very different feel from it. I understood that what they were going for, and in my mind, they didn't execute it as well as they could have, but they were going for something set in the universe that felt like a different story. Like it felt like a gritty war drama as opposed to science fantasy, which is what the Star Wars movies originally and remain. It was much more grounded in the day-to-day struggles of these soldiers and these small-time heroes trying to do good for the galaxy, so to speak. So I would suggest that they want to capture part of the aesthetic, but not the whole aesthetic that Game of Thrones has.
I'm going to throw this out there that in many ways, the Game of Thrones story that we have now is very different from the Game of Thrones story that we started this entire series out with on the television show. So I don't think it's that much of a problem. And in fact, I would prefer that they do more of that sort of emotional or atmospheric break.
That makes sense. So you mean like if I'm getting what you're saying, that the show is sort of moving in this high fantasy-ish direction, sort of heightened, more epic battles and like swords and sorcery and all that kind of stuff. And so it would kind of make sense for this successor show to like take that and run with it. Take that sort of end game for Aswaf and run with it in like their own direction.
That makes sense. Although
is that I'm not trying to.
What I want.
What you want?
Oh boy.
What I want is for it to like take all that high fantasy stuff, take it to the next level, the stuff that's going on now in the show. Like I'm fine with that. They're probably not going to have dragons. I mean, they might have dragons, but presumably not tamed because the Valyrian Empire wouldn't have existed yet during the Age of Heroes, theoretically. Because the Age of Heroes would be about 8,000 before Aegon's conquest, and the Valyrian Empire is at least, I guess, it could have been before 5,000 before Aegon's conquest.
There's stories that they learned it from the Great Empire of the Dawn or Ashai in the World of Ice and Fire. So it's implied there were dragon riders long before Valyria.
I'm fine with the Great Empire of the Dawn and Ashai. I mean, there might be dragons, there might not be. I wanted to go that high fantasy direction, but I still want us to go back to some of, because I'm going to be a hater right now, that depth of character and story that we had in the first few seasons. And from what I've seen of Jane Goldman's work, I think she can pull it off, because I thought there was a lot of really great character building and interaction in, especially like First Class. And also in Days of Future Past. And I think she does a good job of deepening and creating that emotional foundation.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm going to throw out some haterade too, even though this was my preferred pitch thing. It's really, really, really hard to do good high fantasy most of the high fantasy that people have done on TV or movies, specifically with a medieval setting, is pretty bad. It's very hard to do dragon riders, and it's very hard to do like actual real fantasy heroes. Not in the sense that we know them, which is Game of Thrones is more or less like Accursed Kings for quite a while, and then suddenly you're like, oh, it's actually Lord of the Rings style stuff. But if you're starting off with the very, very high fantasy, I don't.
Yeah, I mean,
I want to
this is
see
my
it.
question.
But
This was my question.
It's hard.
Yeah, this is basically what I was trying to ask earlier, which was that, like, do you think they can actually do that? Keep the, I mean, I think what makes Game of Thrones is the real quote unquote characters. Like
I would say
that's
they've
HBO's
done the best
brand,
I've
right?
ever
With
seen.
The Sopranos and The Wire, and like all through all these shows, that's the through line. Is like these very real characters. So do you think it's possible to do that kind of real characters with this high fantasy level stuff?
It still needs to be on the characters.
Yeah.
If you just do it on the special effects and the high fantasy, you're going to have a real bad series probably. You can't just show off world building and magical systems and expect that to be a good show.
I don't know if this is in Stardust, the whatever it's adapted from, but Jane Goldman did write a Sky Pirate, a very high fantasy thing, which is actually made in Stardust into a parody rather than taking it seriously. So if she were to do a Sky Pirate in, say, this Game of Thrones spinoff, would she be able to pull it off as taking it like it's super serial?
Yeah, with foppish Robert De Niro, right?
I'm gonna throw this other question in
great.
there too, in terms of if she can pull off the high fantasy elements or not. Do we know what the budgets are for this show? Because that, of course, affects.
Yeah.
I mean, that affected the first few seasons of Game of Thrones, and of course, like the story started out a little less fantastical, but also that made it more doable for them in terms of budget.
It's a good question. We know that the Amazon show is apparently going to be $1 billion, is what they're estimating right now.
Wow.
Which is insane in terms of its scope and its audacity to throw $1 billion at a project. And I guess they're extremely confident that they can make their money back on the show. I've got doubts, but I guess we'll have to see on that. I would imagine that if this show gets picked up from its pilot, we're looking maybe at like season 3, season 4 money to start out with, and then progressing forward after that. The thing is, and Ilya, you were kind of maybe you weren't, but I kind of caught that you were alluding to this. Like the character work in season 1 and season 2 of Game of Thrones were excellent, but they were there because you couldn't feature the Battle of the Green Fork. You remember, Tyrion gets knocked out right at the start of this huge battle that erupts into Game of Thrones.
That's a good point.
But so they had to focus more on these scenes that are present in the first book in A Game of Thrones and in A Clash of Kings, but very much they focused on these scenes because they didn't have the budget to do these sweeping dragon shots or these huge, these huge camera shots of the Battle of the Wall, or the Battle of the Bastards, that single tracking shot of Jon Snow pushing his way through the chaotic battle. I would really almost prefer it if they started with essentially Game of Thrones season 1 money and built these characters up and didn't use the special effects that they're going to be tempted to utilize from the beginning. And frankly, there might be a shortfall that viewers will be expecting the show to pick up right from season 8, which we think season 8 is going to be just a climactic 6-episode huge dragon battles versus White Walkers and betrayals and all these things. But you actually have to create the setting for these characters to grow, and you have to create the characters, develop them, write good dialogue around them, and write good characteristics and conflicts within them. And that's important. And my fear is that they're going to overemphasize the special effects and overemphasize the things that Game of Thrones in later seasons has become known for, and has done a great job. Their VFX and SFX is amazing in Game of Thrones season 5, season 6, season 7, season 8, hopefully. But at the cost of some of the character work, which was very strong, I think much stronger in the earlier seasons than it became in the later seasons.
I have faith. I'm just going to throw it out there. I have faith at the moment. I've only seen her X-Men movies, that Jane Goldman's going to pull off the character work, because part of the crux, I think, of those X-Men origin stories are that and sure, maybe some people are already familiar with the lore, but part of the crux is that the relationship between Professor Xavier and Magneto was different back then. And so what happens and transpires between them, that climax, that like betrayal, that parting of ways, doesn't mean anything unless that relationship is really established and you see what their values are and how they get along together. So I think that she can pull that off, whatever those characters end up having to be. But I haven't seen some of that other stuff. I saw Stardust, I don't know, a decade ago. So I don't remember.
I kind of want to see it now. It sounds
so
good.
it's stayed with you.
Did you see Kick-Ass?
Oh wait, yeah, I saw Kick-Ass, but I also saw that a long time ago.
Yeah.
I saw Kingsman. That was pretty good.
Yeah, Kingsman is good.
One point I wanted to make about the setting that we're talking about for the story is obviously we're looking back at these characters from what we know from the World of Ice and Fire, where these are now legendary figures that like Bran the Builder started House Stark, Garth Greenhand gave birth to like 100 children. They became all these great houses, and Lan the Clever found the Lannisters. But they don't have to be that way in the show. They can start off as nobodies, and you can do a lot with that. Especially, I mean, obviously we'll figure it out as the audience, and it'll be fun seeing them get to the point where we see the legends. But it doesn't have to be what we see in season 7 and presumably in season 8, where these are like the mega versions of their houses, where Dany's like the ultimate Targaryen, Jon's the ultimate Stark. Well, House Stark back at this time were petty kings. They were no more than just like another random lord in a valley. So you can do a lot with that character development. You can do a lot with a world that doesn't have the political setups that we know now.
They don't have to follow any of these characters either.
Sure.
Like Lan the Clever, Bran the Builder. It could all just be an amalgamation of different stuff that Jane Goldman comes up with, or that George has been spending time on.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the conceit is to interact with those kind of like legendary figures, because you could see it being like, I mean, you could see a show that is literally like the Avengers, and you've got like Bran the Builder and Lan the Clever, like putting their power rings together or whatever. But you could also see a show maybe where there's like an ordinary dude who is basically like Sir Braun or Sir Dunk,
exactly,
who interacts with these characters but is just bopping around. And like there's a whole lot of room there to come up with a really interesting character and sort of central cast that can interact with legends without having to ruin the magic.
I think Dunk is, now that you just said that, maybe they just pitched Night of the Seven Kingdoms, but in the Age of Heroes. Like we'll just fly around Dunk in the Tall, and he'll meet these people in the same way Dunk does, where he meets Aryan Brightflame, he meets Bloodraven, but they're tertiary characters. The story's about Dunk. Maybe let's do that. That'd be great.
If you're following 3 main characters, and let's say one is like totally, oops, I hit my mic.
There in your bed.
Let's say that one is like learning magic, and one is totally devoid of any like Star Wars. Like Luke is learning the Force, Han Solo is totally outside of the Force, has nothing to do with it, and Leia. I guess then you have like the Leia character, which is. But what would be in the Age of Heroes?
Secret Princess? I guess.
Okay, so I have a question. So in that not a blog entry I was referencing earlier, there's this thing where George says, meanwhile, Jane Goldman, Brian Helgeland, Max Borenstein, and Carly Ray are all at work on the other 4 successor shows. I've been working with them as well, some more closely than others, and I'm excited by some of the ideas they're coming up with. Do you think this is one of the projects that George was working closely with, or is this one do you think that was just kind of he was giving occasional input on, or was this something that he was like step day by day interacting with Jane and ensuring that she got the concept and the pitch just right, because he's very interested in this project, because he says, I'm excited by some of the ideas they're coming up with, which implies that there's some of the ideas he's not necessarily fond of.
Right.
I gotta figure that this is one he was super excited about. I mean, the stories from Eilian and Linda of how much they cut from the world of Ice and Fire, how much he delivered. That he loves this kind of stuff. He loves the Age of Heroes. He loves coming up with fake history, and especially having a blank slate. Like we know from as he's writing A Song of Ice and Fire that his big problem is that he's hampered by the stuff he's already written, so he's not allowed to be as creative as he wants to. This is wide open for George. That's got to be almost like the perfect pitch to George R. R. Martin at this point. It's like, we can do your world, but literally anything you want. Just go for it.
I'm going to disagree 100% there.
Wow.
Interesting.
I think George really wanted to see his Targaryen history on the screen. He wanted to see the dance. He wanted to see maybe the conquest. But this kind of Age of Heroes stuff, I think he likes writing. Obviously, he likes writing it. He wrote, an absolute crap ton of words for the World Book. But I think that what he likes about it is making up the like wild stuff that we'll never know the truth about. I mean, his quotes on like Bran the Builder, when he talks about Bran the Builder, he says, "No one can even say for certain if Brandon the Builder ever lived. He is as remote from the time of the novels as Noah and Gilgamesh are from our own time." And so I think he likes them in that context, that it's like, coming up with these wild legends that we'll never know the truth of. I don't know if he would want to do a story in the Age of Heroes that it forces you to confront the truth of those legends. He likes he likes having the edge of the map or the edge of the book, the space where there's, dragons and God knows what out there, and we don't know what's happening.
The space between pages.
Yeah, he likes that. He likes that a lot, and that's the reason like the map of the world isn't actually a map of the world, and it's the reason that Bran the Builder is written very ambiguously as a historical figure and not as like just not as straightforwardly as other fantasy writers might take
Sure.
their history. So I think he was probably less interested in this one. That's my hot take. That he was probably like, okay, this sounds interesting, I guess, but like I don't really have any personal interest in diving into it myself. You guys are welcome to do what you want with it.
Knowing George,
yeah,
I'm sure he would love to talk to Jane Goldman whenever he could.
I mean,
instead of Write the Wind's a Winner.
Yeah, that's true too.
Yeah.
That's true too. Yeah.
That's where my take like kind of falls in the middle of all these things. Like, I think that George would be excited about this possibility. I think that the strength of an Age of Heroes story is that we have so little of it that it's not tied to any canon that George has necessarily said. It has that ambiguity that affords him to be a little more hands-off and work on the books, as opposed to having a really heavy touch on it. And along with all that, so I think that he would be excited about it in terms of the possibility of kind of making something that's like wild cards and his comic universe, but within the Game of Thrones universe. But there is also a point to the fact that the Targaryen histories are very much what excite him, because he does have that affection towards the realistic histories, or basically just his take on like a more brutalist history than what's necessarily afforded in those romances, which is what he kind of wants to respond to with Game of Thrones, what he wants to respond to with the histories that he's written in Fire and Blood that make up a larger portion of the world of Ice and Fire, whereas the Age of Heroes is in very many ways that I don't want to say chivalric romance, but kind of, because you have those stories like Florian and Jonquil.
Yeah,
Those are the
Cinnamon
things
Star
that
Eyes.
those are the things that he's literally reacting against.
Right,
So,
right.
Unless he wants to very much continue doing the subversion of that, even though it takes place within that sort of, literally within that setting, then I think he has to be a little more hands-off, and I think that we as book readers would want that and might want to benefit from that.
You said it all very well. So yeah, that's all. Yeah.
And this could go either, it can mean nothing or it could mean whatever. But it is interesting that as of we're recording this, and this was announced about 6-7 hours ago from when we're recording this, that there's no new, not a blog post from George R. R. Martin on it.
Yeah.
I remember this distinctly when Night Flyers was announced by Sci-Fi. Like it was almost within 30 minutes that George was on, had this huge post of right there up on his Nada blog. But for this one, there's not one out there yet. Maybe he's. I mean, I know I also want to be sensitive to him as well because I know that he lost a very close friend and Carter Desbois recently, so he has not been as active on his blog recently, and I know he was really torn up about that. But he did post about wildcards a few days ago, so take that for what it's worth.
Do you think in that sense though that this means that it wasn't George's decision which one got bought by HBO, that this came as almost a surprise to him?
I don't think it was ever George's decision. I think it was all in the hands of HBO. It sounded like the way that George had framed it was that he was one of the contenders to have one of his shows about his universe picked up. But yeah, I would say it was all on HBO, and I think HBO, again, like I said earlier, very well might pick up a Targaryen history someday down the road. It's just that this one's going to be produced first, and I guess that, as I think about it, it makes sense that you would chronologically want to do the Age of Heroes show before you do the Aegon's Conquest show, before you do the Dance of the Dragon show, or however the different shows that are potentially being pitched over to HBO were pitched and selected.
He was listed as a writer in the article for this one. It wasn't just Jane Goldman; it was George R. R. Martin and him. So presumably he's involved with all of them at some level, I guess. But yeah, I think that makes sense. That maybe he had a favorite, maybe he had his thumb on the scale. Maybe that's what Fire and Blood was about. He's like, guys, look how cool it is, and they're like, yeah, we're gonna go with Jane. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, when he talks about, and has talked about in the past, back when he used to talk about writing things that weren't A Song of Ice and Fire, but set in that world, he's talked about, like an Aegon the Fourth or Aegon the Unworthy, I Claudius style thing. He's talked about that novel's worth of Bravos material he has for Arya. These sort of very, sort of focused, political or at least grounded sort of stories. So I don't know. I keep thinking about the question of whether or not he's how stoked he is for this, and I don't know. It seems like he's more stoked for those kind of pseudo historical dramas as opposed to pseudo mythical. If that's a distinction that makes sense.
Those other ones are probably a lot more closer to the stuff that George has written, because he's only written these things is like a tangent, a little anecdote in the world of Ice and Fire. He hasn't fleshed them out like he has the Targaryen histories, or I don't know. Not even Corlys Valerian isn't really fleshed out either. But
I think you're right. They don't have massive amounts of pages in a row of the same context. I mean, the same content, but they are littered throughout the world of Ice and Fire. Almost every house starts with some sort of Age of Heroes story or how they got to Westeros. So he is thinking about it, but I think you make a good point that it's not a focused thing where he's really thinking hard about the Age of Heroes as a singular idea, the way he thinks of the Westerlands or the Targaryens or something like that.
Well, and so many houses trace their lineage back to the Age of Heroes, but I would say that's George commenting on how everyone wants to claim that their lineage can go back to, Charlemagne or whatever, that
Garth,
being able to claim that you're descended from Garth Greenhand, even if that has no basis in reality, is a status symbol, and that the myths are as much about that. So yeah, I guess coming back to what Eliana was saying, the myths have so much to do with what's going on specifically in A Song of Ice and Fire, and the way we interact with old stories and things that, it's weird to think of the old stories now being the focus.
As a worried A Song of Ice and Fire reader, I do wonder if George is going to end up focusing on how would these stories in the Age of Heroes go, and what can I add of my own flavor to these that I haven't already added, and starts thinking a lot more about what happened in the Age of Heroes rather than anything relevant to really the main series and the Winds of Winter.
Wouldn't that be better than wildcards, though?
Well, it's kind of... Jane could lift stuff from wildcards, I guess, to some degree, and pull little pieces from there and that, and litter the universe, because it is about superheroes-ish, maybe. We assume so, at least I think.
Plot
it's not
twist.
what we think it is.
Garth Greenhand, known for, I guess, having a green thumb, is in fact Meat House Man, and not about
Oh
the vegetable.
no, we're not doing Meat House Man.
That's the plot twist.
It's not what we think it is. It's really 1,000 worlds.
Oh God.
There's actually a point I wanted to make about Garth that I think is pretty good. That what a lot of the stories about him in the World of Ice and Fire and the main series are that he's this like benevolent, godlike figure of the first men who is so great. But then there's these little hints in there that he's actually like kind of a death god, and it has to do with the weirwoods and sacrifice. And like we're talking about this in terms of it could be like a superhero story, but it could go very, very like less high fantasy and more brutal, because that's what first men culture really was like in Westeros. It was extremely hard life. They were cutting people's throats instead of weirwoods all the time to water them, quote unquote. So there's a chance it's less high fantasy than we think, and just more like Ramsay style stuff. Maybe not from Jane Goldman, but it's a possibility.
It could be really dark fantasy because of maybe some fan reaction to the reading of the Forsaken chapter as well, like how well that stuck with people. And book readers, maybe they figured that this would be something general audiences would be interested in, to do something that's like horror fantasy almost.
I want my
superhero fantasy.
Yeah, let's get some like Warhammer 40k stuff.
Yeah, it could be like that, or it could be like Lovecraft, very
Some
Lovecraftian.
chaos gods and the Necrons and all that good stuff. Yeah.
Isn't Warhammer 40k like fascist?
Oh, it is. Yeah, and it's
yeah.
also
It's
there's a lot of garbage. But you know, it's the grim dark.
That's the word, grim dark. Yeah.
It literally is the origin of grim dark. So yeah. Anyway, yeah. You know, that's sort of just brutal magic and like, oh my god, that guy's guts are falling out of his ears or whatever. It's, I don't know. I don't know much about Warhammer. I assume that happens all the time.
Intestines off weirwoods, all that kind of stuff.
Lends itself to some good villains, I guess.
Yeah, right. Good, quote unquote good villains.
When you think of Garth Greenhand, do you guys think of the Jolly Green Giant? Is that just me?
Yes, I do.
Now I do.
I think of them like actually, the image in my head is from the Christmas Carol, the Ghost of Christmas Present.
Yep.
I think.
Yep.
Yeah.
No. Which one am I?
See that.
Yeah, is that the one?
Yeah,
It's present.
Present. Yeah.
That's my mental image of Garth.
Yes.
Second, actually slightly more serious.
Okay.
So I do think of him as the Jolly Green Giant, but like we were talking earlier about how it could be grounded kind of like Game of Thrones. I do think they should do that fantasy direction, but if it's the story that we think we know but turns out we don't know, and of course George is trying to be like all of these stories were bullshit, maybe that could be a direction that he's going in. I mean, there could be a lot less magic than we expect. Like, what if Bran the Builder, before he becomes the guy who's Bran the Builder, if this is an origin story, he's just like a dude. He's like, Jesus was a carpenter, right?
Exactly.
Jesus was born to carpenters. He was born in a manger, and that's like what we do. We follow people like Bran the Builder or Garth Greenhand from their very humble beginnings. Like Land the Clever was a level 1 rogue.
Exactly. I'm on board, Eliana. High five. We're on this.
You just slap your own hand.
I did.
You notice I
That's
didn't
sick.
actually make a motion to.
It's okay. I provided it in case you didn't.
Hey.
Yeah.
But I think it's a very interesting way they could take it. And with some of Jane Goldman's stories, like with Kingsman or Kick-Ass, those are notably not fantasy at all. They're fantasy in the sense that the Kingsman action is like extreme movie action, but there's nothing like strange going on there except things work out too much. So she can work in non-magical places if she wants to.
Yeah, that was a problem in Kick-Ass in that it kind of missed some of the points of the comic, which interestingly, even though it was a few years before, we're pointing out some of those elements of toxic fandom and I just rapidly turned off my camera.
Nice
My
doggy.
partner was moving behind me. I'm this dog now, and
I always thought that was your dog.
no, I found the Instagram account it belongs to. It is not my dog. But yeah, like Kick-Ass, so that is a concern that I have, right? Kick-Ass was very much a sort of tongue-in-cheek story that criticized some of those elements of toxic fandom of like fantasy, not in terms of like the genre, but when you fantasize about these heroic ideas and how that can lead you astray and that gets axed, like the consequences of like lying to a girl and pretending to be her gay best friend and stuff, like these things get axed in the movie for a more tight ending, I guess, or a happy ending.
Have you guys seen James Gunn's Super? No.
Nope.
It's kind of
No.
like a reflection on. They were both made at the same time, but it's a reflection on the superhero genre, and it's a bit more grounded. It stars Rainn Wilson, and it's by James Gunn is the guy who does
Guardians,
of the
right?
Galaxy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, from my alma mater, SLU. What up? Holla out there, anybody?
Yeah, sure.
But no, you guys should watch it. It's actually really, really good. It also has what's her face in it? The person. Oh, the girl from Juno.
Ellen Page.
Yeah, she's really good. It's really great. You guys should see it.
Okay.
Do we have anything else we wanted to say, or are we going to wrap this up?
No, I mean, I'm ready for our. We'll just buckle down for our 3-hour Quill and Tankards for every episode of the spin-off, I think.
Oh boy.
Because I mean, we're all gonna watch it, right? I think that could
Oh,
be
yeah.
the final question here.
Oh yeah, duh.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I will see this pilot.
Yeah, I guess I have to.
Yeah. I guess. Okay.
You
You
don't
know what?
have to.
One final question actually is, how do you guys want to adapt the spoiler tagging system to incorporate the spin-off shows?
Spoilers, everything extended, Game of Thrones show, plus
Spoilers origins.
Spoilers Origins. That's it.
Origins.
Ooh.
That might. But then, do we do Spoilers Origins season 1, season 2?
Yeah,
Like,
we'll break it down by episode as well.
And would Spoilers Origins cover the World of Ice and Fire and Fire and Blood Volume 1? Or
Only
is
if
it
you
just
do
gonna be the TV show?
spoilers origins plus. Yeah, origins plus.
Extended. Origins plus extended.
There we
In
go.
all seriousness, won't it fall under spoilers extended?
Yes,
Yes.
it will. Yeah.
yeah.
Basically, everything spoilers extended.
Yeah. Depending on I mean, if there's popular demand, I guess we would do some. But anyway, this has
Spoilers
been
name when it comes out.
this has been an evening at the Quill and Tankard with the hosts of Maester Monthly, your favorite pseudo monthly podcast hosted by the moderators of the Song of Ice and Fire subreddit. I have been one of your hosts, Michael, also known as Bookshelfstud.
I have one last thing to say, and that was that the Pokemon Origins movie and anime
shit.
was knocked
was-
out of the park. And
Yes.
this is called Game of Thrones Origins. I'm gonna judge it based solely on the Pokemon
I
Origins.
hope it's
Completely
based on
different
Pokemon.
franchise.
I hope that's what it is.
Yeah, I've been another one of your hosts, Glass Table Girl, also known as Eliana.
I've been one of your hosts, Matt, also known as JoeMagician.
Oh, I've been Aaron, also known as AdmiralKird.
And I've been Jeff, better known as BryndenBFish.
As always, you can find us on Twitter, on Facebook, Maester Monthly, YouTube, Maester Monthly, which is probably where you're consuming this, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, I think, also, WordPress, and of course, always on the Song of Ice and Fire subreddit. Thank you all for listening.